the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the cigarette was not the ubiquitous social accessory it would later become. To understand how war made the cigarette, one must first understand the intense social, moral, and legal hostility it faced before the first shots of the Great War were ever fired. In the Victorian and Edwardian eras, the cigarette was a mysterious, poorly understood novelty, and in the dim light of ignorance, as the documentary suggests, is born fear and prejudice. Before 1914, smoking a cigarette was not seen as an act of sophistication or rugged masculinity. Instead, it was viewed as the distinct vice of the underclass. It was associated with criminals, vagrants, and rogues. In the rigid social hierarchies of the time, the proper way for a gentleman to consume tobacco was through a pipe or a sturdy cigar. These methods required time, a sedentary setting, and a certain level of financial stability. The cigarette, by contrast, was cheap, quick, and disposable, traits that linked it to the transient and the untrustworthy. In Great Britain, the cigarette was often derided as unmanly. It was seen as effeminate compared to the heavy, smoke-filled. Figures of immense cultural authority, such as Henry Ford, were vocal opponents. In a 1914 pamphlet, Ford argued that a study of almost any criminal would reveal him to be an inveterate cigarette smoker, suggesting a direct link between the little white stick and moral bankruptcy. Early health reformers and temperance activists, the same groups pushing for the prohibition of alcohol, found a common enemy in the cigarette. They viewed it as a poison pill that threatened to enfeeble an entire generation of young Americans. Because cigarettes were easier for youth to obtain and smoke discreetly compared to pipes or cigars, they were seen as a gateway to broader delinquency. This atmosphere of fear led to a wave of legislative crackdowns that many modern smokers would find shocking. Between 1995 and 1921, 15 different U.S. states actually passed laws banning the sale of cigarettes. For a brief period in American history, the cigarette was on the same path as alcohol, total prohibition. Temperance activists likened the cigarette vice to alcoholism, believing both were destructive side effects of a modernizing society that needed to be purged to maintain national strength. However, there was a strange contradiction brewing. Despite these bans and the heavy social stigma, per capita consumption of cigarettes actually increased by more than 1,000% between 1900 and 1920. The war against the cigarette was failing even before it truly began, but it lacked a catalyst to flip the script and make the habit respectable. The documentary highlights that the war against the cigarette never reached the same heights as the war against alcohol because another, far more literal conflict rudely derailed it. As 1914 approached, the cigarette was still a blight on the health of the average citizen and a harbinger of social collapse. But when the world was plunged into a global industrial war, the very traits that made the cigarette cheap and quick suddenly became its greatest military assets. The stage was set. The underclass vice was about to be drafted into the trenches, and in the crucible of World War I, the cigarette would be reborn, not as a symbol of decadence, but as an indispensable tool of the modern soldier. The pariah was about to become the patriot. When the First World War broke out in 1914, no one could have predicted that this global catastrophe would not only redraw national borders, but also permanently alter the consumption habits of humanity. Before the war, as established in Part 1, the cigarette was a marginalized product. However, within just 4 years, it transitioned from a social pariah to an indispensable companion for millions of men. This shift wasn't accidental. It was a mechanical necessity born from the brutal reality of modern industrial warfare. 1. The statistical explosion. The sheer scale of cigarette consumption during World War I is staggering. Across all major participating nations, the numbers tell a story of a product that suddenly became the primary choice for tobacco users. Great Britain. Between 1914 and 1920, cigarette consumption nearly doubled, eventually representing the vast majority of all tobacco sales. France, sales rose from 3.7 billion units in 1913 to 4.9 billion by 1919, a 31% increase in just 6 years of conflict. Germany, before the war in 1914, produced roughly 13 billion cigarettes. By the time stable records emerged again in 1925, that number had skyrocketed to over 30 billion. In the United States, per capita consumption rates more than doubled between 1915 and 1920, with some estimates suggesting a threefold increase. The primary driver behind this surge was the inclusion of cigarettes in the official rations of British, French, German, and American servicemen. Governments and military leaders realized very early on that nicotine was a powerful tool for maintaining soldier morale. In the pre-war era, the pipe was the symbol of the masculine tobacco user, but the trenches of the Western Front were no place for the slow, methodical ritual of the pipe. Several factors made the cigarette the perfect wartime drug. Portability and speed. A cigarette is small, light, and pre-rolled. In a high-stress environment where a soldier might have only a few minutes between duties or under the threat of shelling, the ability to get a quick hit of nicotine was vital. You couldn't easily pack, light, and clean a pipe while standing in knee-deep mud and freezing water. The calming effect. Nicotine is both a stimulant and a relaxant. For soldiers surrounded by the constant threat of death, the smell of rotting corpses, and the deafening sound of artillery, the cigarette provided a momentary psychological escape.
The ability to get a quick hit of nicotine was vital. You couldn't easily pack, light, and clean a pipe while standing in knee-deep mud and freezing water. The calming effect. Nicotine is both a stimulant and a relaxant. For soldiers surrounded by the constant threat of death, the smell of rotting corpses, and the deafening sound of artillery, the cigarette provided a momentary psychological escape. It was a solace in a sea of mayhem, helping to steady the nerves of men who were often pushed to the brink of psychological collapse. Appetite suppression. As noted by figures like British Minister of Food David Thomas, smoking reduced the sensation of hunger. In a war where logistics were a nightmare and food rations were often scarce or unpalatable, a cigarette helped soldiers endure on less. The strategic importance of the cigarette was confirmed by the highest levels of military command. General John J. Pershing, the commander of the American Expeditionary Forces, famously underscored this when he was asked what the troops needed most to win the war. He replied, "You ask me what we need to win this war? I answer tobacco, as much as bullets. Tobacco is as indispensable as the daily ration. We must have thousands of tons without delay." This statement effectively elevated tobacco from a recreational luxury to a strategic munition. It was no longer a vice, it was a requirement for victory. Militaries essentially became the largest drug cartels in history, systematically addicting their fighting force to ensure they remained nervously efficient on the front lines. Before the war, groups like the YMCA were fierce opponents of smoking, viewing it as a gateway to immorality. However, once the reality of the front lines became clear, even the YMCA began distributing cigarettes to soldiers. Their rationale was brutally pragmatic. Smoking was a lesser evil compared to alcoholism, gambling, or the psychological trauma of war. They argued that denying a soldier a cigarette while he stood amidst shell and shrapnel was absurd. As one YMCA member put it, many a sorely wounded lad died with a cigarette in his mouth, his passing made slightly less bitter by what was once called the poison pill. World War I served as a global incubator for cigarette addiction. The military took millions of young men, many of whom had never smoked or only used tobacco occasionally, and turned them into heavy, daily cigarette users. When the war ended in 1918, these men didn't leave their habits in the trenches. They returned to their civilian lives as walking advertisements for the cigarette.
Because these men were returning heroes, the social stigma associated with the cigarette vanished. If the brave soldier who saved the nation smoked a cigarette, how could it be seen as the vice of a criminal? The pariah had successfully been rebranded as the patriot, setting the stage for the massive marketing campaigns of the 1920s that would cement the cigarette's place in modern society. As World War I drew to a close in November 1918, the tobacco industry faced a unique crossroads. They had millions of newly addicted customers returning home, but the pre-war stigma of the cigarette as a shameful vice still lingered in the minds of the older generation and conservative lawmakers. To ensure their wartime gains weren't lost to post-war prohibition efforts, cigarette companies launched some of the most sophisticated and aggressive marketing campaigns in history. The core strategy of post-war marketing was to tether the cigarette to the image of the returning hero. If a man was brave enough to charge through no man's land, surely he was man enough to choose his own tobacco. Brands like Chesterfield were among the first to strike, releasing advertisements just months after the armistice. These ads featured men in uniform, Air Force pilots, Navy sailors, and Army infantry casually enjoying a mild smoke. By using the soldier as their primary spokesperson, the industry successfully rebranded the cigarette. It was no longer the mark of a criminal or an immigrant, it was the mark of a patriot. Smoking became a symbol of the very freedom and democracy the soldiers had fought to defend. This patriotic shield made it socially difficult for temperance activists to attack cigarettes without appearing to attack the veterans themselves. In Great Britain, companies like Wills took a different approach to cement brand loyalty: the cigarette card. In 1917, they released sets of cards inside packs depicting different military units and scenes of sacrifice. This was a masterstroke of psychological marketing. It gamified addiction, encouraging smokers to buy more packs to complete their set of 24 cards. More importantly, it created a tangible link between the act of smoking and the collective national effort of the war. Furthermore, the war effectively killed the effeminate reputation of the cigarette. Before 1914, the pipe was the undisputed king of masculine tobacco use. However, because the cigarette was the soldier's habit, it inherited the rugged, battle-hardened associations of the front lines. The pipe began to look old-fashioned and sedentary, while the cigarette looked modern, active, and American.
Having conquered the male market through the soldier archetype, advertisers began to realize that the cigarette's new reputation for independence and modernity could be sold to the burgeoning feminist movements of the 1920s. The war had disrupted the old social order so thoroughly that the forbidden fruit of the cigarette was now ripe for a total cultural takeover. By the dawn of the 1920s, the cigarette wasn't just a product, it was a cultural juggernaut, fueled by the memory of the trenches and the clever exploitation of national pride. While World War I introduced the masses to the cigarette, it was World War II that transformed its steady growth into a meteoric, unstoppable ascent. By 1939, the cigarette was already on an upward trend due to industrialization and urban life, but the outbreak of a second global conflict pushed production to levels once thought impossible. The scale of consumption during the Second World War dwarfed everything that had come before. To visualize this, consider the shipments. During World War I, a total of 7.5 billion cigarettes were shipped abroad for military use. In World War II, that number skyrocketed to 92 billion per year.
In the United States alone, yearly output climbed from 172.5 billion cigarettes in 1939 to a staggering 267.8 billion by 1945, a 55% increase in just 6 years. This surge was so intense that it created a cigarette famine on the home front, leading to civilian hoarding and panic buying, because nearly 30% of the total supply was being diverted to the armed forces overseas.
Marketing during this era became even more aggressive. Advertisers didn't just sell a product, they sold a connection to the front lines. The patriotic gift. Companies like Camel and Chesterfield began encouraging women to buy cartons of cigarettes as gifts for their husbands or boyfriends overseas. They marketed the cigarette as a piece of home that a soldier could carry in his pocket. Targeting the new workforce, as women entered the war industries, the Rocky the Riveter era, ads began to reflect this. One famous 1944 Vogue ad depicted women in various war vocations, from mechanics to office workers, all praising Camel cigarettes as their smoke of choice. One of the most clever marketing ploys of the war came from Lucky Strike. They famously changed their packaging from green and red to white and red, claiming that the green ink contained copper, a metal desperately needed for the war effort. Their tagline, "Lucky Strike Green has gone to war," became a cultural sensation. In reality, the change was likely a calculated move to appeal to modern aesthetic tastes. White packaging looked cleaner and more medical. Regardless of the truth, the campaign successfully branded Lucky Strike as a patriotic sacrifice, further embedding the brand into the national identity. By 1945, the cigarette had moved beyond a simple habit. It was now a global currency. In the chaos of war-torn Europe and Asia, a pack of American cigarettes was often more valuable than local paper money. The military had become an incubator, not just for addiction, but for a new global culture where smoking was a tribal act, a signifier of solidarity, conformity, and survival in a world gone mad. While the United States and Great Britain were using the cigarette as a tool for morale and patriotism, a very different and historically ironic dynamic was unfolding in Germany. To understand why the cigarette became so dominant in post-war Europe, one must look at the failed anti-tobacco crusade of the Third Reich. The Nazi Party was, in many ways, decades ahead of the rest of the world in its understanding of the health risks of smoking. Driven by an obsession with racial purity and the perfection of the German body, the Nazi government launched one of the most aggressive anti-smoking campaigns in history. They restricted cigarette advertising, banned smoking in many public spaces, and even funded research that established a strong link between smoking and lung cancer. Adolf Hitler himself was a fierce opponent of the habit, famously referring to it as the wrath of the red man against the white man for the gift of liquor. Under his regime, smoking was characterized as a sign of weakness and a drain on the national health. However, even the most ideologically driven regimes must eventually bow to the realities of war. As the German military, the Wehrmacht, began to face the brutal conditions of the Eastern Front, the Nazi leadership realized they could not sustain the morale of their soldiers without the very vice they despised. In 1941, Joseph Goebbels, the Minister of Propaganda, stepped in to block further anti-smoking campaigns. He argued that it was hypocritical and dangerous to preach against smoking when the state was providing millions of cigarettes to soldiers in the trenches to keep them fighting. Just like the Allies, the Nazi state became a drug provider by necessity, choosing nervous efficiency over public hygiene. The most significant impact of the Nazi anti-smoking stance came after the war. Following the fall of Berlin in 1945, Germany and much of Europe underwent a process of denazification. Anything associated with the Nazi regime was viewed with suspicion and contempt. Because the Nazis had been the world's most vocal opponents of smoking, post-war anti-smoking efforts were stigmatized as fascistic leftovers from the Nazi era. This created a cultural vacuum where smoking was seen as a symbol of newfound democratic freedom and a rejection of the old restrictive regime. In West Germany specifically, cigarette consumption surged after the war. For a population that had been told what to do, what to think, and how to live for 12 years, lighting up a cigarette became a small personal act of rebellion and a return to normalcy. The cigarette was no longer just a drug, it was a signifier that the health police of the Third Reich were gone. This historical quirk ensured that the tobacco industry faced almost no organized medical opposition in Germany for decades, allowing the habit to become deeply entrenched in the post-war European identity.
In the aftermath of World War II, the cigarette evolved from a soldier's companion into a vital tool of international diplomacy and economic reconstruction. As Europe lay in ruins, the United States launched the Marshall Plan, 1948 to 1951, a massive aid package designed to rebuild capitalist democracies and prevent the spread of Soviet communism. While we often think of the Marshall Plan in terms of steel, coal, and machinery, one of its most surprising exports was tobacco. Between 1948 and 1951, tobacco accounted for a staggering 4.4% of all products shipped to Europe under the Marshall Plan. This wasn't an accident. Industry advocates and lawmakers, many from southern tobacco states, lobbied hard to include their product in the aid packages. Congressman John W. Flanagan, a prominent tobacco producer and industry advocate, argued that distributing American tobacco would aid in eliminating or retarding the spread of ideologies antagonistic to democracy and to world peace. In the eyes of Washington, the cigarette was a luxury of freedom that could soften the blow of post-war austerity and keep the hungry populations of Europe from turning toward communism. There was also a cynical economic motive behind this generosity. During the war, the American tobacco industry had ramped up production to unprecedented levels to meet the demands of millions of soldiers. When the war ended, the industry suddenly found itself with a massive excess supply and a shrinking domestic market. The U.S. government effectively saved the tobacco industry by buying up this surplus and sending it to Europe for free. This served two purposes. It stabilized prices for American tobacco farmers, and it seeded the European market with American-style cigarettes. Before the war, Europeans often preferred local blends or Turkish tobacco. After the Marshall Plan, they were hooked on the Virginia and Burley blends that defined American brands. The influx of subsidized American tobacco had a devastating effect on domestic European industries. Greece, in particular, saw its backbone tobacco industry threatened by the flood of cheap, free American cigarettes. When the Greek government protested to the Economic Cooperation Administration, the body tasked with carrying out the Marshall Plan, they were told that no accommodations could be made. The pressure from the Southern tobacco lobby in the U.S. was simply too strong to ignore. The free market was being engineered to favor the American cigarette. Perhaps the most lasting impact of the Marshall Plan was how it tied European government budgets to the cigarette. As these nations rebuilt, they began to rely heavily on taxing tobacco as a primary source of income. This created a mutual dependency. The people were addicted to the nicotine, and the governments were addicted to the revenue. By the late 1980s, the cigarette came to represent around 80% of all tobacco consumption worldwide. The Marshall Plan didn't just rebuild Europe's buildings, it built a post-war culture where the little white and ground stick was a permanent fixture of daily life, backed by the economic interests of the state itself. The story of the cigarette is ultimately the story of the 20th century's greatest tragedies were harvested for profit. While we may never truly know what the cigarette's trajectory would have been in a peaceful century,
We can say with certainty that the two world wars acted as a high-octane accelerant. They took a product that was socially radioactive and turned it into a global necessity. The military served as the world's most effective marketing and distribution agency. From the Japanese and the Germans to the British and the Americans, nearly every major military in World War I and World War II included cigarettes in basic rations. This created a massive captive audience of young men who were systematically addicted under the guise of morale. When these wars ended, they released millions of walking advertisements back into their communities. These men didn't just bring back medals, they brought back a habit that they shared with friends, families, and children. The tribal act of smoking in a trench, a symbol of solidarity and survival, was imported into the living rooms of the post-war world. In the decades following 1945, smoking became a means of unspoken social assimilation. Because it had been the soldier's habit, it carried a credential of toughness and conformity. To smoke was to be part of an in-group. This social acceptance, forged in conflict, allowed the tobacco industry to ignore the growing medical alarms for years. How could something that helped the greatest generation defeat evil be truly bad? This cultural momentum was so strong that even as the health risks became undeniable in the late 20th century, the habit remained deeply entrenched. In Europe, the legacy of the Nazi anti-smoking stance and the Marshall Plan's influx of American tobacco created a stronghold for the cigarette that persists to this day. Finally, both world wars facilitated a level of global interconnectedness that the tobacco industry exploited. New markets were opened, supply chains were established, and an intercontinental tobacco trade was primed to spread the habit to every corner of the earth. The cigarette became a globalized commodity, often prioritized over domestic agriculture and health. The cigarette reached its peak popularity in the twilight of global conflict. While its influence has finally begun to wane in the United States and parts of the West, it still burns on in many developing markets. The documentary concludes with a sobering thought. The cigarette was born from the chaos of the battlefield, but its casualty count in peacetime has far exceeded the body counts of the wars that made it. It remains a little white and brown stick that continues to drag the hand that smokes it to an early grave, a lingering ember of a century defined by war.